vulnerability is what an unleashed leader is, and really being able to be filleted open in front of your team, acknowledging where your shortcomings are, having the self-awareness to be able to talk about where your shortcomings are, and inviting the team in to talk about that with you. That sets such a great example for the reciprocal conversation, of course, but it diffuses any of the defensiveness that might exist in an organization when the leader is able to talk about their own failings without getting defensive and embrace them. That's unleashed leadership for you.
Welcome to the Unleashing Leaders podcast, where we work with willing leaders to accelerate the changes you seek. We'll learn from the experiences of different leaders facing real challenges and distill practical, purposeful steps to apply in your context. I'm Lee Scott, your curious co-pilot. Together, let's make positive changes for our companies and communities. Welcome to the Unleashing Leaders podcast. Today, we are joined by Adam Goodman. Adam is the CEO at Goodman's. He is the third generation CEO of this family business, about 200 employees based primarily in the Phoenix, Tucson, and Albuquerque regions of the American Southwest. Today, we're going to be looking at some generational leadership and what those transitions look like, and also how to be aware of the encroachment and some strategies for dealing with systemic racism that has its way of creeping into various businesses. A very top of mind conversation for us today, and Adam, and looking forward to hearing your insights on both of those topics.
Thanks. Great to be here. Great to be unleashed.
Adam, tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up in a family business. Most organizations don't make it past the first founder, much less a second or even a third. So there's something remarkable going on at Goodman's. Give us a little insight about how you got involved in the business and what made for the possibility of having that level of sustainability across generations.
I worked in the business all through my childhood. Every spring break, summer break, winter break, I was in the warehouse or out in the field doing installation. And of course, there was dinner table conversations every night about office furniture. And the thing that I knew was that the job that I have now here as CEO of this company, that's exactly what I did not want to be doing with my career. I wanted nothing to do with this. Can you imagine being a 16-year-old kid and all your friends are going on spring break and you're working in a warehouse moving furniture around? My career ambition was to be a newspaper publisher. It still is between you and I, Lee, but at the moment I'm pursuing this.
It's a good gap job until the newspaper industry can sort out some things. And then you'll be ready to sweep in and just take over, right? Tell us a little bit more about the actual business. You guys are in furniture distribution and sales. Tell us a little bit about what that was like. And yeah, what was that summertime job when you were working in the warehouse?
We're 200 people, 100 million in revenue. We're 70 years old coming up this next year. And we're focused on corporate customers, government customers, higher education, and healthcare. It's really the four verticals that we spend most of our energy on. We're a distributor for Herman Miller and Knoll, if you're familiar with those brands, and have had a partnership since 1968 with Herman Miller.
Wow, no, that's great. We actually used one of the new Herman Miller chairs as an intro activity for strategic planning for a 12,000 employee client that we had literally just earlier this week. And they can charge $1,000 for this chair.
Lee, if you're going to buy in bulk for 12,000, it's $995.
That's the buddy deal. I love it. You're working in these summer jobs and you're like, this is not the career path for me. At what point did that begin to evolve? And obviously, you probably didn't come in as the CEO on day one. What prepared you to be able to justifiably take the helm of this family business?
So I did not come into the town business out of school. I went into the newspaper industry. I was on a fast track program with Gannett Newspapers to be a publisher by the time I was 30. And I had been doing it for 3 or 4 years when I came home for Thanksgiving and my father had the talk with me. And the talk was about, look, if you ever want to know what it's like to be in a family business, to own your own business, this is a perfect opportunity. It's right here for you. And he said these famous last words: you can always go back to newspapers, which is just amusing to think of now. He didn't know what was going to happen to newspapers. I took the leap of faith and came back into the family business, and I started just learning all the different areas of the business. It was fun and it was challenging, but it wasn't fulfilling, honestly. And I wasn't exactly sure what I was missing, but I had a cocktail party conversation with the CEO of Herman Miller, where he made a comment about the role of a CEO is to create a sense of purpose about something bigger than themselves for employees, to belong to something bigger than themselves. And that struck me as completely foreign. What is he talking about? That doesn't make any sense at all. The purpose of the company, as near as I could figure, was just to sell as much stuff as possible. And I started reflecting on what it was about newspapers that was so compelling to me. And I realized that what I love about newspapers is they can shine a light on an issue in the community and get attention drawn toward it and resource drawn to elevate it and make change happen. That's really what it is. And slowly, as I came into leadership and took over, I pivoted the whole purpose of the company to be about making an impact on the community. And we became a benefit corporation, the first one in Arizona back in 2011. And that really defines who we are and why we exist to make an impact on the community. So now we're on this great journey where we are attracting people who believe what we believe and want to be part of what we're doing. There's like a zillion cool creative stories about how we take the surplus assets, resources, and talent that we have that we can make to benefit the community with. We talk to our employees often about if we didn't exist, this community would absolutely miss us. Certainly not a lot of companies our size can say that, but there's no doubt we're making an impact on the community and there'd be a void if we weren't here. Now it's fulfilling. That's a reason to get out of bed in the morning.
That's amazing. Our particular canvas might leverage the fact that we know a thing or two about commercial furniture for education and healthcare institutions, but we use that to fuel a greater mission and a greater impact. That's what I'm hearing from you, Adam. I'll roll back just a little bit to something you mentioned earlier about the value of not being somebody who came in as the entitled successor to the business. It was kind of funny. My older daughter, Sierra, she's 19 now. We were at an event at some table and we ended up talking to some gentleman who turned out to be like the great grandson or grandson of a state lauder. He's like, I'm managing the family's estates and everything. And he gave us some advice, said, hey, look, to my daughter, if you ever want to be in your dad's business, let's be very clear. We have a family rule that says you can't come into our business. You have to go do something else different so that you're an add to the organization, not just an inheritor. I mean, and that's where you bring additional value. And it sounds like you did that by going out there and learning how to tell stories, how to shine a light on things that are relevant to a community, how to be able to stimulate a meaningful conversation for change. You add that into the family business, you now have a net more of just why I happen to know about how to sell things that have four legs on them.
That's a really insightful comment. And I hadn't thought of it that way. I definitely remember when I first joined Gannett, my dad talking about the importance of doing what you just said, of going out and getting experience somewhere else. It wasn't as conscious as Estee Lauder, but there's no doubt there's a zillion leadership lessons I learned through that whole experience that I was able to bring, both good and bad.
Having been related to someone very deeply involved in the newspaper business, it doesn't exactly cultivate all the best attributes of a human either. There's some challenging aspects to it. So you ended up stepping in, and now there's this mission driven aspect of the role. And you're seeing that as a CEO, it's not just operational, it's not just sales. Really, it is to shape the opportunity to make an impact in your community. And then something occurred to you, like something came across your awareness, and you're like, wait a second, there is a discrepancy in the things we say we value and yet how we are actually operating. And that was a bit of a shocking revelation to you. Could you be willing to share a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, sure. The something that happened was the murder of George Floyd. And there was this national conversation about systemic racism and whether or not it existed was the conversation. And it occurred to me the idea of something being systemic means it's everywhere. And so if it's everywhere, then it's in my company too. And our purpose statement says, in part, the reason we exist, making an impact in the community, but also seeking justice for the marginalized. It's part of our purpose statement. And so you might say we're a pretty woke company. And so could it possibly be here inside our company? So I decided to take a look at the numbers. After George Floyd's murder, our marketing team posted a Black Lives Matter square on Facebook. And we were some kind of civil rights heroes. Clearly, we're not. The problem's somewhere else. I was a little embarrassed about that Black Lives Matter square because it just felt performative. That really was the inspiration to turn the microscope back on ourselves and to take a look at our own house.
It always reminds me of the saying that many far wiser leaders than you and I could ever hope to aspire to be of many different religions all have this similar meme, which is basically, if you want to change the world, you got to look inside. That is your leverage for change. So you looked around and said, wait a second, what's happening here? So what was that initial discovery and vulnerability? What questions did you ask? What conversations did you have?
The first thing I did was looked at our employee census, and it's uncanny. It almost exactly matches the demographics of Arizona and New Mexico. Percentage white, Latino, Black, Asian, Native American. It's really uncanny.
So from a population ratio perspective, it ain't here.
We're clean. Yeah. And that's really where most people, I think, stop the conversation. I've certainly talked to a lot of CEOs who say, we're fine because look, that describes hiring discrimination. So that's what that describes. And clearly, there's no hiring discrimination in our company. I took it a step further, though. I wanted to dig a little bit deeper. And I looked at it in terms of leadership. I wanted to see, are we promoting people, the people in our leadership? What's the demographics there? And that turned out to be a completely different story. If it's about something like 37% of the company is Latino, and yet 10% of our leadership team was Latino, there's a discrepancy. That's pretty interesting. And then I looked at wages. Now, this is important to understand. We do the EEOC audits every year. We've never had a complaint or clean bill of health. And I wanted to look at just purely the demographics of our pay, not taking into account seniority, not taking into account what position you're in, performance, anything. I just wanted to see if you have a white person and a brown person, what's the comparison? And it was a startling advantage. White people making $1.21 for every dollar that a Latino person makes. Then I start digging further and realize in our highest paying jobs, which are sales for sure, but also design and customer service, it's 90% white in these jobs. And then I look at our operations team, the guys out in the field putting everything together, and it's 85% Latino. I think I found the issue out here. There's the discrepancy right there.
Okay, excellent. So you got curious, you asked some questions, you didn't settle for the superficial. You really started to look for what are some indicators, what are some things that might not be aligning with what our stated values are. So as you made that discovery, then how did you elevate? Because as a newspaper editor, you would help a community spotlight an issue, be able to elevate it, to raise awareness on it, but do it in a way that is at least attempting to tell the story objectively with some facts. So now as your own newspaper editor with a community called your own team, how did you elevate this conversation and what was some of the initial reactions that you received?
I still needed to understand the mechanism by how this was happening. I had to keep digging into it. And I learned the first thing I had our leadership team do is take the Harvard implicit bias test. It's fascinating. There's a whole long list of these different unconscious biases that you might have. And you take this test and it'll help you understand. It's every conceivable category. I'm quite amused by it. There's one, do you have an unconscious bias against Donald Trump? Whatever you think of him was fine, but is it unconscious?
And it's fascinating about how it works. It's looking for micro delays in decision making and affinity that kind of reveal. And it could be a positive or a negative affiliation. It's like, hey, I tend to have a halo effect on this and a horn effect on that. And that's the Harvard implicit bias tests that are out there. So definitely something worth personally checking out. So you did that.
We did that. And every single person on our leadership team had an unconscious bias against Latino people in particular. In the Southwest, this is the predominant population we're talking about. And that was interesting. There was something liberating about figuring that out. Now we can at least name it and talk about it and see it. There's no malintent. I'm not a racist. However it got there, it's there. Now we can know it. That unconscious bias is a belief. And the way this mechanism works is beliefs lead to actions and actions, the discrimination. And so now I got to figure out how is that discrimination happening. And what I learned about is a concept called occupational sorting. The easiest example to understand is boys are doctors and girls are nurses. Boys are engineers and girls are teachers. And societies sometimes have their own occupational sorting, but industries do, and sometimes companies have their own occupational sorting. And I think it's broader than us. I think it is the industry. I only did the research on myself. If you are a high performing, high potential installer out in the field, we come and talk to you about your career and your ambitions and what do you want to do. And what was happening, we're steering you towards being a project manager, which is essentially managing the guys in the field. And that's the ceiling for you right there. You're not getting above that.
And that's a function of proximity and familiarity. That's where they came in. And when they're recruiting and talking about folks, they're talking to folks in their network. And so that's just how it starts. And then you're unintentionally capping versus asking yourself the question, could you do something radically different? Which is interesting because in your example, your dad bridged that gap. He could have been like, newspaper kid, you're not going to know anything about a private for-profit furniture company. He facilitated that transition. He's your dad. So he's going to open that door for you. How are we unintentionally not opening that door? We're opening a window, but we're not opening the door. And that compounds over many decisions. And then bam, salary discrepancies and occupational sorting.
You're describing it exactly right. And as our installers are thinking about their careers, they're looking at people who have taken the path before them and they just see, well, that's where I go. I just go right there. And the thing is, particularly about our business, our installers are incredibly knowledgeable about our industry. They could be excellent designers, for example. They could be excellent salespeople. There's some technical skills we got to teach. But my goodness, the fundamental knowledge about the industry, it's fantastic. And we're missing that opportunity over and over again.
That's where it becomes systemic. The word systemic doesn't necessarily mean it was nefarious and malicious and intended, although there's certainly been examples of that. But in your case, it was just one little groove happened and then another groove followed behind that. And then now you have this chasm that is unintentionally channeling these folks based on a variable that really doesn't have any merit to the potential talent. In fact, almost perpendicular, right? These people might arguably make better designers than some of the folks we might be recruiting from a design school program. We just become blind to that. And then that's how it sneaks up.
Now that I've sort of understood this, I've literally heard managers say things like, I don't know, I just don't see him in that role. What is it you don't see about this person in that role? That's the flashing red light for sure.
So you had your fellow executives say, like, hey, we're all susceptible to this. Let's be courageous and honorable and shine a light on this. That raised some awareness. You started to recognize the mechanisms was really in the career development conversations where this was implicitly happening. What did you do?
The first thing I wanted to say is the question has got to be, what was the goal? What we're trying to do? And I want to be clear. I wasn't looking to have a quota. I didn't have an inherent need to make sure we matched the state. But as the leader of the company, what I'm thinking is, are we putting the best people in the best roles? Or is there something that's blindly causing us to steer people into wherever we think that they should be for whatever silly reasons? I had to get out of the system. I want to make sure we're putting the best people in the best roles.
And that's not controversial. We all have a smattering of talent that's distributed across any population. I'm trying to distill out where are those talents? How can we make sure that they're in the best roles? That in turn is going to have the greatest impact for the customers. That's going to create the net access. And like you mentioned, the resources, the time, and the talents to be able to have a greater impact. So if you're letting something leash you, something that holds you back from accessing that talent, suddenly there's no controversy in wanting to root that out and address it versus we should be falling in line with this quote. It's like, we're missing the point on the goal. That is a great distinction there, Adam. I've never heard that before.
Yeah, thanks. The other point I want to make is I do appreciate and respect the fact that a lot of companies have the hiring bias problem and they're completely lopsided. And you hear them talking about, where am I going to go and find Black engineers or whatever it is they're looking for? And so I feel like we were blessed, not a problem here. But I want to acknowledge that's an issue. I don't have any solutions for it. And that's a different episode of Unleashing Leaders that you're going to have to go get that answer from. We had all the talent in house. It's just a matter of, as you said, the career development of these people. So now the answer you've been waiting for. How did we elevate this thing? It seemed as easy as going to a meeting with all of our installers, which, by the way, they're 6 a.m. meetings. And I feel like a bit of a hero just for getting to the 6 a.m. meeting. And I want that acknowledged. And so I got in front of our guys and I pointed out, I shared all this data. We've clearly got an unconscious bias going on here. We can name all these high performer, high potential installers who've gone on to be project managers, and not one of them has gone in this direction or this direction or this direction. And I'm here to tell you, or we're awake, we see it. And if somebody here is interested in providing for their families with a better career that they can do more and provide for their families, then raise your hand and we want to talk to you. And it was crickets. And that's when I gave the option, you know what, come talk to me afterwards. You don't have to do it in front of everybody.
You said give yourself credit for showing up at 6 a.m. I want to give you credit for being able to go out there and ask a very scary question, which would have probably terrified any other leader in the world and was also obviously terrifying for them. They were like, wait a second, we don't even know what to do with this. This is so many standard deviations outside of the norm. I'm in shock. So did that feel like what you did failed, or you're like, maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree? Or did you reframe it to be like, no, actually, that just tells us that this is almost a shared bias and we got to work together to bust through this wall?
Bingo. That's exactly what it is. It's so insidious that it's baked into everyone. It's systemic. It's baked into everyone. They had never seen anybody take that path. They couldn't even imagine it for themselves. I talked about like, look, we'll upskill you. We'll put you through community college to get the design skills. We'll give you sales training. We can do all that because you already know this industry so well. And it was just unfathomable. And so that's when I realized we've got more work to do.
Okay. So that's a great point in the story. And being the CEO helps. You've got some positional authority, you've got some resident personal power that you're able to draw in on this. But were you alone in this fight? I mean, who else did you recruit along the way to be a partner, maybe on multiple perspectives and what was going to be a long-term journey here ahead of you?
Our entire leadership team was aligned with this. Now, remember, we're a B Corp. These are people who are attracted to the company because of our purpose and what we stand for. This wasn't a big leap for them, even though they all have unconscious biases. They were still consciously quite aligned and appreciated. I was actually doing a talk about this. I should also mention, I published an article, an op-ed in the paper, which was newspapers, right back to my roots there, where I laid all of this out. I wanted the whole business community to see that it's okay to acknowledge that I have a problem and challenge them really to look inside their own companies to see what really is going on there. And I must say, our lawyer did not like that idea very much. They strongly advised against it. And what's also funny is they took the time to rewrite it, and it was just so neutered and watered down that it was like, why did you even bother? You're not going to bill me for rewriting this. So now that's out in the community, this challenge, which I must tell you was incredibly well received by the business community. And it was really gratifying to hear people coming forward to say how this inspired them to look at their own businesses a different way. I'm very proud of that. But we still had a problem to deal with ourselves.
One of the things I really like about how you're framing this whole thing is it's not coming from a place of blame and shame and guilt. It's coming from a place of curiosity and discovering and truly wanting what's best for the people, for the business, for the community. When you're like, okay, how controversial again is that really to want to be for people, for the business, for the community? I think framing the challenge and then owning it in your own personal space, it wasn't pointing fingers. It was just, it's saying it's right here in my house. That is incredibly liberating. And it's kind of like when you set an ambitious goal, but if you go in the closet and you're like, okay, I'm going to lose 10 pounds and you kind of like whisper it to yourself, that ain't ever going to happen. But if you go out there and you're like, all right, listen, you all, you're going to have to hold me accountable to this, but I am changing the way I eat, the way I sleep, the way I exercise, because I want to have a lifelong, life full of journey. That's a different public position. And it's harder to back down from that. So you reframed it in a positive way that was opportunistic and you owned it. And you made it public, which made it harder to just set it aside. So two good leadership motivational tactics that you're putting into play there, Adam.
So I'm going around town telling them my story and admitting I don't really know how to solve this thing. And a woman in the audience from Michigan actually came up to me afterwards and she said, I know how to solve this. And that was great to hear. And what she talked about was you've got to be able to remove all that subjectivity out of the promotions and development career development process. You got to just pull it all out and really get to make objective decisions. And the way you do that, she described, is first thing to do is you benchmark high performers in each of the different roles throughout the company, management roles, sales roles, design roles. You benchmark them based on DISC profiles. And so now we know what great looks like in each of those roles. And then we give the same assessment to everybody in the company. Everybody goes through this. And now we can stack rank you, Lee Scott, here's your test. And here's where you line up. You've got a natural inclination for design, for example. Now you're missing some key characteristics and behaviors, but with those, we can help upskill you there. We can give you the technical training if you don't know anything about how to use the software. That's easy. So let's talk about that now. And so our conversations, they're data-based now. Now the high performers and high potentials, we get to sit down with them and say, here's the options ahead of you. You're most naturally suited for this. And I know you've never seen anybody do that, but I'm telling you, you've got what it takes to be successful right here. And we're going to help you get there. It's an exciting change.
So you created a competency model based on the high performers. What actual competencies you bringing to bear from a communications approach, from a knowledge base, from a skills base? And then you said, okay, now let's do assessments as part of people's development plans. And we've talked on some prior shows about the importance of making professional development plans available at every level in the organization. One of our first podcasts was with Jason Lippert on the manufacturing side of the house. He's like, we have it all the way down. It took a while to get there, but they have it. but we're now doing that based on a competency model. And then you can say, okay, hey, you seem to have a high indication for these areas. These are the ones that are missing. Now it becomes a question of how do we fill those gaps versus how do we wait until you see yourself in this role? Because just like you did as a child, you didn't see yourself in your current role. And so many of us don't, but we need a leader that's willing to see something that maybe I didn't see before. And this gave you a language to be able to connect those dots.
Beautifully articulated. Yeah, absolutely. I like how you keep bringing it back to my experience too. That's nifty how you do that there.
All of the secrets of our leaderships usually get baked in when we're kids. They end up finding their way back. Because honestly, if you hadn't had that, you wouldn't have done what you're doing. Your unique journey set you up to be the right leader at the right time for this opportunity. Of course, it comes back to that.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. So now you're up to date. This is the journey we're on. We've had lots of these super interesting career conversations. And I must say, to be able to sit down with a member of our installation team who's a high performer with high potential and to explain to them, you have the natural instincts, attitudes, behaviors, competencies to be successful in this job here, that's so encouraging from the other side of the table to hear something like that because I can't even imagine it. But there's the data right there proving that's the case. And now I feel like we're doing a much better job of putting the right people in the right roles and getting the best people for each role. That's great.
Well, it's part of the whole philosophy of a strengths based approach where it's like, hey, let me look at your strengths. Let me look at your natural inclinations and your talents. And to be able to do it in a way that doesn't infer it based on your ethnicity or your religious practices or your gender or where you were born. Those are all the things that we didn't have any say in whether they were us or not. The place of power is in the choices I make. So how do I really make sure you're aware of those? But that's not easy, Adam. I mean, that takes time to be able to critically look at certain roles. It's much easier to say, hey, if we want another one that does this, have that person find a friend of theirs to do it. And you're going to end up sticking in certain socioeconomic groups that way. That's a proxy, but that's not a very good one.
I thought we'd be able to fix this pretty quickly. What I told our team is this problem took 400 years to get here. It's going to take some time to undo it. There's just nothing quick and easy and fast. It's going to take some time, certainly to be a sustainable solution.
Have you begun to see some material shifts?
Oh, absolutely. There's success stories for sure. It took a year and a half probably to find this solution. We were casting about trying to fix it without understanding how. We're 18 months into this solution part of it, and it's just slow.
Yeah. And I think that's something that we talked about in an earlier podcast about different types of challenges that leaders face. A type one is a known problem with a known solution somewhere. You just got to find it and do it. Type two is a known problem with maybe an unknown solution that takes some innovation to create a solution. Then there's the like 400 year in the making, or actually probably closer to 400,000 years in the making. I think this was happening even amongst subspecies of Homo sapiens back in the day. It took millennia to get here. And now, so raising the awareness, revealing those value conflicts, and be able to make purposeful action, that's a type three problem. And that's not just take two of these and call me in the morning. This takes sustained effort. Adam, this has been fabulous. Really appreciate you sharing your vulnerable story and the way that you invited others to participate, and also recognizing you took some bold moves and there was maybe some crickets along the way, but you stuck with it long enough to start to see some of those early returns. So what's one success story, Adam, that has already begun to emerge?
We have a high performing, high potential installer who indexed well for going into the design profession and personally was interested in it, had observed it and wanted to learn more. So we start with what we call go and sees. So that's just shadowing designers to confirm that this is really the type of thing I'm interested in before we start investing. And then it was finding community college courses that can start to upskill on the software that's needed and all the other technical skills that go into being a designer. That's a couple year process in itself. But we're a 70-year-old third generation family business. We don't think in terms of months or quarters or even years, but we think in terms of decades. And so this is going to take us 3 years to get you through this training process, but we got time and that's okay. And so that's a good example of the journey we're on.
Excellent. And then that creates a visible example. Now there's a new groove. Now there's a new scratch. And then we can send the next person. Now it's a viable career pathway that doesn't have the implied bias in it anymore. It's like geological glaciers carving out the earth to make new rivers.
Yeah, you were doing a metaphor on a record album, but I kept seeing the glacier metaphor in my head.
Thank you again, Adam, for the generosity of your time. for your vulnerability and for your commitment to making a difference in the Phoenix and Albuquerque areas there. I think this will be a story that resonates in the hearts in a lot of leaders who are wrestling with this, but not quite sure where to even start. So thank you for that.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Great talking to you.
Thank you for joining us today on the Unleashing Leaders podcast. Subscribe so you don't miss a moment that could be the key to your next breakthrough. Let's stay connected and contribute together by grabbing that @Unleashing Leaders handle on LinkedIn, YouTube, or your favorite network. This is Lee Scott. Keep learning, loving, and leading. Our future and our communities are counting on us.